Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The disappearance of the camp. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A chance for me and my friends to escape the noise of the city, to breathe the fresh air of the national park, and to leave behind the endless cycle of work, stress, and technology. We were all students eager to get away from our academic pressures. Our plan was simple: hike through the woods during the day, camp under the stars at night, and enjoy the peace of nature. But from the moment we arrived, something didn't feel right. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, nothing. Just an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy blanket. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But as we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We chose a small, isolated spot near a clearing, surrounded by towering trees. It was peaceful at first. The sound of the river nearby was gentle, and the wind whispered through the leaves. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared for the night. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, twisting in strange ways. We joked about it, saying that we were just spooked by being in the woods. But the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just the usual unease that comes with being away from home, it was something else. Something deeper. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, I noticed something unusual. The firelight flickered in strange patterns, casting long, unnatural shadows that didn't seem to belong to the trees around us. I glanced around at my friends, but they seemed oblivious to the change. They were laughing, telling stories, and passing around snacks. I tried to ignore the sensation of being watched, but it was hard to shake off. Then, just before we decided to call it a night, a faint sound broke the silence. A rustling. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate. Something that didn't belong. I glanced over at the trees, trying to make out any movement. But all I saw was darkness. The sound stopped, and the forest fell silent again. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice a little too sharp. My friends looked at me, confused. "What?" "It's probably just an animal," one of them said, shrugging it off. I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. The rustling had felt too deliberate, too intentional. As if something, or someone, was out there, watching us. I tried to push the thought from my mind as we crawled into our tent. The others were already settling down, their breathing slowing into steady rhythms. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the canvas above me, listening to the soft whisper of the wind, and trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. I don't know why I finally drifted off, but when I woke up the next morning, it was to complete silence. No birds, no wind, no distant sound of running water. Just an unnatural, oppressive quiet. And then I noticed it. The tent. It was gone. Our tent, the one we had set up the night before, was no longer there. All that remained were our personal belongings scattered across the ground, sleeping bags, backpacks, clothes, but the tent itself had vanished as if it had never been there at all. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. We couldn't have left it behind. The wind hadn't been strong enough to carry it away. And besides, we had all fallen asleep inside it. I rushed out of the clearing, hoping to see the tent just a few feet away, but there was nothing. Just the empty woods. Panic surged through me. "Where's the tent?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The others stumbled out of the bushes and from behind trees, looking as bewildered as I felt. "What are you talking about?" one of them asked, staring at the ground where the tent had been. The silence was deafening. No one spoke. We all knew what we had seen, or what we hadn't seen. "We've got to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But we didn't move. We stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could the tent have just disappeared? As I looked around, the unsettling quiet of the forest pressed in on me. My skin tingled, and I felt that familiar sensation again, the feeling of being watched. And this time, I couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong. Something was out there, and we were alone, completely exposed in the middle of the wilderness. It was just the beginning. We stood in the clearing, our eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the scene. The air seemed thicker now, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the pulse in my ears growing louder. "Okay, let's not panic, Hannah," one of my friends said, trying to sound calm. "There's got to be an explanation. Maybe the tent just blew away?" Her voice wavered at the end, betraying her own doubt. I shook my head. No way. The wind wasn't that strong, and we would have heard it if something moved in the night. We all stood there for what felt like an eternity, each of us desperately searching for a logical explanation. But nothing about this made sense. The tent wasn't just moved, it was gone, as if it had evaporated into thin air. "We need to stay calm and figure this out," said Mark, always the practical one, though his words did little to calm my nerves. "We should head back to the parking lot. It's probably just some kind of prank or mistake." We gathered our things, the eerie silence pressing down on us like a weight, making each movement feel unnatural. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, seemed magnified. The trees, once comforting with their gentle presence, now loomed over us, their shadows stretching longer than they should. We began walking, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the disappearance of the tent, it was the way the forest seemed to have changed. The path that had seemed clear the night before was now unfamiliar. The trees looked different, their branches twisted, their trunks darker. The quiet had become unsettling, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As we walked deeper into the woods, the tension between us grew. None of us spoke. The crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor was the only sound, but even that felt like it didn't belong in the silence. Suddenly, I heard it again. A rustle. But this time, it was closer. And it wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the brush. It was deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps. My heart stopped. I turned to look at the others, but they were too focused on their own unease to notice. My mind raced. Could it be another group of campers? But no one else had been nearby when we arrived. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer with each passing second. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark stopped too, his face paling as he listened. It's just an animal, right? A bear maybe? We need to keep moving. He didn't sound convincing, even to himself. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but now it was suffocating. The oppressive quiet was louder than ever, as if everything in the forest was waiting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a shiver running down my spine. We kept moving, the path becoming harder to follow as the trees closed in around us. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the air felt heavier with every step. The oppressive quiet seemed to deepen, making it harder to focus. It was as though something was actively trying to push us off the path, into the unknown parts of the woods where we didn't belong. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I stumbled, my foot slipping into what felt like a shallow hole. The others stopped immediately, looking back at me. "You okay?" Anna asked, her voice tight with worry. I nodded, but as I pulled my foot from the hole, I noticed something strange. The ground around the hole was soft, unnaturally soft. It felt like the earth itself had been disturbed, almost as if something, or someone, had been digging there. I backed away from the hole, my eyes scanning the area. There were no signs of wildlife, no marks to indicate a recent disturbance. The trees around us stood still, their shadows sharp and unyielding. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, my voice cracking with unease. "We need to get out of here." As we continued on, the footsteps that had once been a distant sound now seemed to follow us, just out of sight. Every time I turned to look, I saw nothing but the thick trees and shadows. But the feeling of being pursued, of being watched, grew stronger with every step. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, or my nerves getting the best of me. But as we moved forward, the sense of dread only deepened. Then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It stood just outside the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. The figure was tall, and though I could barely make out any details, I could feel its presence. It wasn't human. It was watching us. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The others were too far ahead to notice, oblivious to the figure that stood motionless in the woods. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? A trick of the light? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. The forest was alive in ways it shouldn't be. The silence, the shadows, the figure in the distance, it was all connected. And we were not meant to be here. I took a step back, careful not to make a sound. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. The figure remained still, waiting for us to move closer, to make the next move. And as I watched it, something told me that if we did, we would never leave the woods again. "Guys," I whispered, but my voice barely broke through the suffocating silence. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The moment I spoke, I saw Mark turn around, a puzzled look on his face. But before he could say anything, I heard the unmistakable snap of a twig from behind him. The figure in the woods was no longer standing still. It moved fast, unnervingly fast. My heart pounded in my chest. The shadows seemed to bend and twist around it, and the figure became a blur in the corner of my eye. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. My body froze as if something deep in me knew that if I turned my back, it would be the last thing I did. "Look!" I screamed, finally managing to break the paralysis in my body. "Behind you! Run!" Mark whipped around, but by the time he turned, the figure had already disappeared into the trees, as if it had never been there. My stomach twisted into a tight knot as I watched Marcus in the dark woods, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. I don't know," Mark replied, his voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here. Now." I nodded frantically, urging the group forward, the weight of fear making each step feel heavier than the last. But as we started to walk again, something even stranger happened. The path ahead of us, the same one we had been following just moments before, was no longer the same. It was different. The trees had closed in tighter, their branches blocking the way, their trunks looking darker than before, like they were alive and shifting, pushing us into the deeper part of the forest. I stopped, my chest tightening as I tried to understand what was happening. "Wait, this isn't the way we came," I said, my voice quivering. "We're just disoriented," Mark said quickly, trying to sound calm but failing. "The woods are tricky. Let's just keep going." But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the path that was different, it was everything. The air had grown colder, and the oppressive silence seemed to stretch longer with each step. The shadows seemed to follow us, moving just out of the corner of my eye, and the silence was suffocating, heavier with every passing minute. "Where are we?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching the dark forest around us. I didn't have an answer. I could feel my mind racing, desperately trying to make sense of everything, but every attempt only made the terror worse. The figure we had seen was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. The path ahead became even more winding, and the trees around us seemed to grow larger, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, trying to pull us deeper into its depths. I stopped again, panic rising in my chest. "We need to turn back. This isn't right." Mark shook his head. "We can't turn back. We have to keep moving. We'll find the way out." But something in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. He was just as lost as the rest of us. We continued on, but now every step felt like it was taking us farther into an unknown nightmare. The trees seemed to press closer, and the darkness felt thick enough to touch. I could barely make out the others in front of me, their faces pale and wide-eyed, their breaths coming in short, nervous gasps. The sound of something moving behind us reached my ears again. The deliberate footsteps. Close. Closer. I spun around, my heart leaping in my throat. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Only the dark, oppressive forest stretching out into nothingness. I was starting to lose track of time. How long had we been walking? How far had we gone? The world around us felt distorted, warped. I couldn't tell if the forest was growing tighter or if we were just shrinking in the vastness of it. It was as if the woods had become alive, changing with every step we took. Then I saw something, a flicker of light through the trees. "Over there!" I shouted, a sudden rush of hope filling my chest. "There's light." We all turned toward it, and for a brief moment, the oppressive dread lifted. Maybe it was a campsite, maybe a ranger station, anything to get us out of the woods. We moved toward it, quicker now, desperate for an escape. But as we got closer, the light didn't look like a campfire or lantern. It was unnatural, faint, flickering in a way that felt wrong. And as we neared, I realized with a sinking feeling that the light was not coming from any fire or lamp, it was coming from something deeper, something behind the trees. A shape. the same figure. This time, it wasn't hidden in the shadows. It stood out in the open, its silhouette barely visible in the strange light, its body tall and thin, its arms stretched unnaturally long. It didn't move, it just stood there, waiting for us. I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Run!" I screamed, not even thinking. "Run!" But the others were frozen in place, their faces stricken with fear, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the figure. Suddenly, the light flickered again, and then everything went dark. The forest fell into complete silence. And we were not alone. When the light disappeared, it felt like the world had shifted. The familiar sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, vanished, replaced by a deadening silence that pressed in from all sides. The air was cold, biting. It felt as if the very atmosphere had changed, as if we had crossed into another world entirely. I blinked into the darkness, trying to adjust my eyes, but it was hopeless. The night had swallowed everything whole. There was no more path, no more light. Only a suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch forever. And then I heard it. A sound so faint at first that I wasn't sure if it was real. A breath. A low, unnatural sound, like something inhaling deeply, only it wasn't human. It came from the shadows, close but just out of reach. I turned toward it instinctively, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness. The trees, black and looming, their branches curling like fingers. I felt a cold hand of terror grip my chest. "We need to go. Now." My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. But as I looked around, I realized that we weren't moving. None of us were. We had stopped, frozen in place, and I couldn't understand why. Our feet should have been carrying us forward, away from whatever was out there. But instead, we stood motionless, our eyes glued to the dark, searching for something, anything, of comfort. Then I saw it. A pair of eyes. They glowed faintly, not like animal eyes, but like something other. The eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the faintest glimmer of light, but I couldn't tell from where. They were fixed on me, unyielding, unblinking. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The terror paralyzed me, making my breath shallow, quick. The eyes slowly shifted, turning towards the others. "Mark. Anna. Move." I screamed, my voice raw with panic. But they didn't respond. They just stood there, staring into the abyss, as if they had become a part of it. The realization struck me with brutal clarity: we weren't just lost. We were being hunted. A low growl, distant at first, began to vibrate through the ground, like the deep rumbling of an animal, only deeper, more guttural. It was coming from all directions at once, surrounding us, closing in. I felt it, the weight of it. The oppressive force of something large, something monstrous, drawing closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation, no logic. The forest itself felt alive, shifting, breathing. It was not the forest we had entered that morning. No, this was something else. Something darker. I stumbled back, my legs trembling, but before I could take another step, I saw it again, the figure. Now, closer. It was no longer just a silhouette, a shape in the distance. Now I could see it clearly. It stood tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched out unnaturally long, its fingers curling like branches. Its body was pale, too pale, like it had never seen the light of day. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but from underneath, two glowing eyes burned through the darkness. The growl I had heard before came from its throat, deep and menacing. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if something was squeezing the air from my lungs. I had to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My feet felt like lead, my legs shaking uncontrollably. The others remained motionless, trapped in whatever spell had been cast upon us. I could hear their shallow breathing, their fear, but it wasn't enough to snap them out of it. The figure stepped forward, its movements impossibly fluid, as if it wasn't quite touching the ground. I saw its mouth now, wide and gaping, too wide for anything human. The sound it made, something between a hiss and a laugh, rippled through the silence. My heart thundered in my chest. There was no escape. We were trapped. Run! I screamed again, my voice breaking, and this time it was like the spell broke. Mark and Anna blinked, their eyes wide with fear as they snapped out of whatever trance they were in. Without thinking, we all turned and bolted. We ran blindly through the dark, the only sounds our pounding feet, our ragged breaths. But every time I looked behind me, I could feel it, its presence, watching, following. The growl echoed in the distance, but it was getting closer. It was gaining on us. The trees seemed to close in around us, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches stretching like hands to grab us. The ground beneath my feet was soft, uneven, as though it had been dug up, disturbed. I didn't know how long we had been running. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. I was losing track of time, losing track of everything except the feeling that something was right behind us. The terror, the cold, the impossible weight of the air, it was too much. And then, suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way again. I fell, tumbling forward into what felt like a deep hole. I hit the ground hard, my body crashing into the earth, the air knocked from my lungs. I gasped for breath, struggling to push myself up, but when I looked around, I realized I was alone. I scrambled to my feet, panicked. Mark? Anna? I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. There was no answer. Only the soft rustling of leaves, the faintest whisper of something moving in the darkness. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except my own breathing. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know if I was still in the woods, if I was still in the world I had known. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was out there, whatever had been hunting us, was still watching. I stumbled through the darkness, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes strained to adjust to the blackness, but it was hopeless. The trees around me were massive, their trunks twisting unnaturally, their branches reaching out like fingers to drag me into the depths of the night. I could feel the weight of the forest, pressing in on me from all sides. It wasn't just the isolation or the fear, it was as if the very earth beneath me was conspiring to keep me there. I called out again, my voice weak and trembling. Mark? Anna? There was no response, only the hollow echo of my own voice, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I tried to move, but every step felt like it was taking me deeper into the nightmare. My legs were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. What was happening? Why had the forest changed? Why was I alone? The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it, a presence, watching me from the shadows. I wasn't alone. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the creaking of branches, as if something, or someone, was moving through the trees, just beyond my sight. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. It was patient, waiting for me to make a move, to make a mistake. I didn't dare to turn around, but I couldn't help it. The sensation of being followed was unbearable. I forced myself to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the vast, empty darkness stretching out behind me, the twisted trees swaying gently in the wind. Yet I knew, somewhere deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. The ground beneath my feet shifted again. I felt it before I saw it, a subtle vibration, like something massive moving beneath the earth, just out of sight. The trees trembled, their leaves shaking like they were caught in an unseen breeze. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, and I shivered uncontrollably. Then, I heard it again. The footsteps. But these weren't just footsteps. No, they were deliberate, slow, almost mocking. They echoed in the space around me, too close, too real. The sound of something large, something heavy, moving through the forest toward me. I turned and ran, but I was no longer sure where I was going. The path had disappeared. There was nothing but the endless expanse of trees, the shadows that seemed to grow longer with each step. Every time I glanced behind me, the sound of those footsteps was closer, louder. It wasn't just following me now, it was chasing me. I didn't know how long I ran. Time was irrelevant now, the world spinning around me as I stumbled through the woods, my legs burning, my breath ragged. But with every step, I could feel it, the thing that had been hunting us, hunting me. It was getting closer, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it. A clearing. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. I ran toward it, my heart soaring with the briefest glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe this was the edge of the forest. Maybe. The ground beneath me gave way again, and I fell. I didn't land on solid earth. No, it felt like I was falling into something else. A deep, empty void, a chasm that swallowed me whole. My body hit the ground with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on cold, damp earth. The air around me was thick and heavy, and the smell of decay hung in the air. I tried to move, but my body was stiff, as though I had been lying there for hours, days, maybe longer. My head throbbed, and I pushed myself up, gasping for breath, trying to understand what had happened. The clearing was gone. The trees were closer now, their twisted branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands. The ground beneath me was uneven, rocky, as if I had fallen into some kind of pit. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, dread creeping up my spine. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the shadows playing with my senses. But no! There was something there, standing in the darkness just beyond the edge of the trees. The figure. It was watching me, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the deep blackness. I could hear its breath, ragged and deep, as if it was feeding off my fear. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body was frozen in place, my muscles locking up with terror. The figure stepped forward, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally as it drew closer. I could feel the air change. It wasn't just the forest now. It was the very space around me. The walls seemed to close in, the ground shifting beneath my feet as if the earth itself was alive, breathing, feeding on my fear. And then I realized the figure wasn't alone. All around me, in the shadows, more eyes appeared. Dozens. Hundreds. They were everywhere, surrounding me, watching, waiting. The figures stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, their forms becoming clearer, their faces hollow, twisted. I had no way to escape, no way to fight back. As they closed in around me, I heard the whispers. Low, garbled voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, a language that didn't belong to this world. The ground trembled, the trees shook, and the air grew colder still. And in that moment, I understood. We hadn't been lost. We had been chosen. The stranger in the house. It started with small things. Little disturbances that seemed so insignificant at first, things I could easily explain away. A misplaced cup here, a slightly shifted pillow there. But the more they happened, the less I could ignore them. My wife, Emma, was the first to notice. "Why does my makeup bag keep moving?" she asked one morning, her voice tinged with confusion. I stood at the kitchen counter, trying to make sense of her words. "Maybe you moved it and forgot?" I offered, trying to calm her. But she shook her head, her brows furrowing. "I swear, I didn't. I always put it in the same spot, and it's not just the makeup bag. It's everything. The lamp, the remote, it's like someone's been in here when we're not home." I brushed it off as stress from work, but Emma wasn't convinced. "You're not listening," she said quietly, the worry creeping into her voice. "I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like we're not alone." Her words stuck with me. I couldn't deny there was something off, but I thought it was just paranoia. It wasn't until a few nights later, when I went down to the basement to grab some old boxes, that I began to feel it too. The basement door, which we usually kept locked, was slightly ajar. I remember stopping for a second, wondering if Emma had gone down there. But no, she'd been in the living room all evening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I pushed the door open further. I expected darkness, but there was something else, something strange. The air felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. My steps echoed in the silence as I made my way to the light switch. As the bulb flickered on, I scanned the space, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed it. There was a faint smell, musty and sour, lingering in the air. I couldn't place it, but it wasn't the usual scent of old furniture and dust. I walked around, pulling boxes aside, but found nothing unusual. Still, something gnawed at the back of my mind, a strange unease I couldn't shake. When I returned upstairs, Emma was sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone. But there was something off about her expression. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting beside her. She looked at me, her face pale. "I don't know, it's nothing. I keep hearing things. Like footsteps when there's no one else here." I tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just the house settling. You know how old it is." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. Every little thing, every misplaced object, every creak in the floorboards, it started to feel like a warning. The house had always felt like a home, safe and familiar. Now it was different. That night, as we lay in bed, I kept thinking about the basement. That cold, unsettling feeling I had gotten when I stepped down there. It had felt wrong. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Something or someone. Then I heard it. A soft creak from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then there was another, followed by the faintest sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart skipped a beat. "Emma," I whispered, shaking her awake. She stirred, her eyes groggy with sleep. "What is it? Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She froze for a moment, listening. "I thought I heard something too," she said, her voice barely audible. We lay there in silence, both of us listening, straining to hear. But whatever it was, it had stopped. The house was silent again. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something was in the house with us. The next morning, we were both tired, drained by the restless night. We went through our usual routine, but the unease lingered. Emma still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And I, despite my attempts to reassure her, couldn't deny that something wasn't right. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when we went through the footage from the security cameras, that we found the first real clue. The basement door, the one that had been slightly ajar the night before, it was wide open. And standing just inside it was a figure. I froze, my stomach turning. It was hard to make out the details in the dim light, but it was clear someone had been in our house. Someone who didn't belong. The realization hit us both like a punch to the gut. Someone had been living in our basement, watching us. And worse, they had been there for a long time. The camera footage was a revelation, but it left us with more questions than answers. The figure in the basement was unmistakably human, but there was something unnerving about the way they moved. Slow, deliberate, like they were trying to remain unnoticed, blending into the shadows. The footage was grainy, the quality poor, but even in the low light, I could make out their silhouette, slender, hunched over, almost as if they were trying to make themselves small, invisible. Emma was the first to speak, her voice shaking. "Do you think they were living down there? How long do you think they've been here?" I tried to reason with her. Maybe it's just someone who was here for a night, or, I don't know, a week. Maybe the previous tenants left something behind. I don't know. But even as I spoke, the rational explanation felt hollow. The thought of a stranger being in our home, watching us, slipping in and out of our lives unnoticed, sent a chill down my spine. We spent the rest of the afternoon combing through every inch of the house. We checked the locks on all the doors, making sure they were secure. We peered into the closets, the attic, and under the beds. I checked the basement again, but there was no sign of anything, no discarded food, no personal items, nothing that would indicate someone had been living down there. But the smell, it was still there. Faint but persistent, lurking in the air, as if it had seeped into the very walls of the house. I couldn't place it, but it smelled like decay, like something forgotten. I wasn't sure what we were looking for anymore. Were we searching for answers? For a clue to who this person was? Or were we hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what had been happening to us? When we finally sat down that evening, exhausted and shaken, I suggested we call the police. Emma agreed, though it seemed like an impossible thought. How could we explain that we had no proof, just a blurry camera clip of a figure standing in our basement? We were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. I glanced at Emma, who looked as startled as I felt. "Who could that be?" she whispered. We hadn't invited anyone over, and there was no reason for anyone to be here. I walked cautiously to the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. But there was a package on the doorstep. I opened the door, my hands trembling. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. It felt oddly heavy in my hands. I turned it over, looking for some kind of clue, but there was nothing. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I carried it inside. Emma watched me, her expression a mix of fear and curiosity. "What is it?" she asked. I didn't know. I hadn't opened it yet. But when I did, I wish I hadn't. Inside was a single old photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It was a picture of our house, but from years ago. In the background, barely noticeable, was the same figure from the basement footage. The person was standing in the shadows, almost hidden, but unmistakable. I could feel my heart pounding as I stared at the photo. The image was too old, too eerie, too perfect in its detail. It was as if whoever had been watching us, whoever had been living in our basement, had been there long before we ever moved in. I dropped the photo, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The implications were horrifying. Whoever had been in our basement wasn't just some transient squatter. They had been living in our house, our home, long before we even set foot here. My mind raced, spinning with possibilities. How had they gotten in? How long had they been there? Why hadn't we noticed anything? I heard Emma's voice, small and distant, asking the question that we both feared the answer to. How long has this been going on? I didn't know. But as I stood there, staring at the photo, the house seemed to close in around me. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier. I looked at the basement door, the place where it all started, and I felt a coldness rise up inside me. The basement wasn't just a place to store old boxes. It was a place of secrets, of things hidden in the dark. And whatever was down there, whatever had been living in our home, it wasn't finished. It hadn't finished with us yet. The house felt suffocating, as though the very air had changed, thickened with unease. That night, Emma and I couldn't sleep. We lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, both of us afraid to close our eyes. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, made my heart race. Every time I thought I heard a noise, my mind went back to the figure in the basement, the photo, the heavy, unsettling presence that lingered over us. "Do you think they're still in the house?" Emma's voice broke the silence, her tone barely above a whisper. I turned to her, trying to hide the fear in my own voice. I don't know. I don't know if they ever left." She was silent for a moment, her eyes wide, reflecting the same terror that I felt. "Do you think they're watching us right now?" I couldn't answer her. The thought of being watched, of having someone in the house who we couldn't see, who could be listening to us, was unbearable. I turned my head to the window, but it was dark outside, the kind of darkness that made everything feel too quiet, too still. The following days blurred together. We locked every door, checked every window, and tried to live like nothing was wrong. But everything felt wrong. Every time I stepped into the basement, I half expected to find something or someone waiting for me. Every time Emma went into the kitchen or upstairs alone, I feared she wouldn't come back. We still didn't call the police. I knew they wouldn't believe us. How could we explain it? A blurry video? A mysterious photo? A feeling of being watched? We had no proof, only a mounting sense of dread that gnawed at us both. Then one evening, while we were sitting in the living room, something happened that made all of our fears real. We were watching TV, the low hum of the show filling the silence. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 9. Emma was on her phone, scrolling through something, when suddenly she froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. I looked up, my heart already pounding in my chest. What do you mean? She put her phone down, her eyes wide, staring toward the hallway. Footsteps, she said, her voice barely audible. I heard footsteps. From upstairs. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The house was empty. The only people here were us. I stood up, slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move, to be calm, to make sense of it. I reached for the hallway light and clicked it on. Nothing. The house was silent. But the fear was real. I could feel it now, thick in the air. My pulse was racing. I grabbed Emma's arm. Stay here, I whispered. I'll check it out. I walked through the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. Every step felt like a trap. I reached the stairs, my hand on the railing. The silence was deafening. And then, just as I was about to go up, I heard it. A faint, scraping sound. A soft dragging noise, like something, or someone, was moving in the darkness above. I froze again, my breath shallow, my chest tightening. The stairs loomed in front of me, an endless shadow. I wanted to run, to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I ascended the stairs slowly, my footsteps too loud in the silence. At the top, the hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and still. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar. I could feel my stomach turn as I approached it, each step heavier than the last. I pushed the door open with one trembling hand. Nothing. The room was empty. Neat. No sign of anything out of place. But then, as I turned to leave, I saw it. The corner of something in the farthest part of the room, behind a chair. A shadow that wasn't quite right. I took a step closer, and then, my breath caught in my throat. It was a pile of old clothes, piled together, neatly folded, almost as if someone had been living there. And on top of the pile, something else caught my eye. A small, silver bracelet. Emma's bracelet. The one she had worn just a few days ago. The one she had left in the kitchen. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and turned back toward the stairs. When I returned to Emma, she was waiting, wide-eyed, her face pale. She didn't have to ask what I had found. She could see it in my face. We have to leave, she said, her voice quiet but urgent. Now. I agreed. We couldn't stay another second. But as I turned to gather our things, I heard it again. A sound from below. A soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Slowly. Purposefully. We were no longer alone in the house. And the thing that had been watching us, it was getting closer. The sound from downstairs was unmistakable now. The slow, dragging noise, accompanied by faint creaking, like someone was moving along the floor, getting closer, step by step. My heart raced, and the room felt smaller, the walls closing in as my mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. I turned to Emma, her face pale, eyes wide with panic. We need to get out. Now, I whispered urgently. She nodded, her breath quickening. We both knew there was no time to pack. No time to think about anything other than escaping this house. I grabbed her hand, and we moved toward the stairs as quietly as we could. My body was trembling, but I couldn't afford to make a sound. We had to get out before whatever was in the house reached us. But then, as I took the first step toward the landing, I heard it again, closer this time, right beneath us. It wasn't the sound of footsteps anymore. It was breathing. Shallow, ragged, but distinct. The breath of something or someone too close. I froze, my foot halfway up the stair. Emma stopped beside me, her wide eyes locked on me in fear. Neither of us dared to speak. The breathing continued, slow and uneven, as if it were coming from the space at the bottom of the stairs. It was impossible to tell how many were down there, or if it was just one person. My mind raced with possibilities. I had to act, and I had to act fast. "We're trapped," Emma whispered. "Not yet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to get to the front door. We just need to make it out." I turned and moved quickly to the hallway closet, where I had placed our jackets earlier. My fingers trembled as I grabbed them and handed one to Emma. She didn't ask questions, just took it with shaking hands, but she was already looking back toward the stairs. "Do you think it's the person from the basement?" she asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. The figure in the basement was haunting enough, but this was different. This felt like a predator, stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head. Now wasn't the time to get lost in theories. I was already thinking too much. I needed to focus. I nodded to Emma, and we moved toward the front door. With each step, my heart pounded louder in my chest, the sound deafening in the silence of the house. I could hear Emma's breath beside me, quick and sharp. And then it came, another sound. A loud bang from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open. Something had broken free from the basement. We were no longer alone. The door downstairs was wide open now, and I could hear someone moving fast, their feet hitting the ground with heavy thuds, like they were charging toward us. I could feel the floor vibrate beneath my feet as whatever was in the house came closer. "Run!" I shouted, and without thinking, I yanked open the front door. But it didn't budge. It was stuck. "Push harder!" Emma screamed. I slammed my shoulder against it, the wood creaking in protest. Panic surged within me as I realized the door wasn't opening. It wasn't locked. It was something else, something that was holding it closed, as if the house itself was keeping us inside. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Too close now. A heavy breath on my neck. "Go! Now!" I shouted. I turned, but there was nowhere to go. The house was closing in, its walls shifting like they were alive, and whatever was following us was gaining. The basement door was now wide open, and I could hear the heavy drag of something moving up the stairs. We didn't have a choice. There was no time left. I grabbed Emma's arm and dragged her through the kitchen. It was the only way I knew to escape the house. The back door. It should have been unlocked. But as we rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The back door was wide open. I froze. In the doorway, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood a figure. Tall. Thin. Its face obscured by shadows. It stood still, its presence suffocating. Its breathing was the only thing that filled the air. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching us. Emma let out a low gasp, her grip on my arm tightening, and without thinking, I shoved her behind me, positioning myself between her and the door. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, It stepped forward, slowly, dragging its feet across the floor, each step deliberate. The silence was unbearable, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, thundering louder than the figure's steps. And then, a low voice, rough and cracked, echoed in the room. "I was waiting for you." The words sent a chill through me. I looked at the figure, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Who was it? How had they been living here without us knowing? What did they want from us? "Leave," I said, but my voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't respond, but I saw its hand move slowly towards something at its side. My eyes went wide as I saw a glint of metal. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Grabbing Emma's hand, I pushed past the figure, shoving the door fully open. It felt like a dream, like I wasn't fully in control of my body, but I was moving, and that was all that mattered. But as we stepped outside, the figure didn't follow. It didn't move at all. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something flicker in the basement window. A pale face. A face I recognized. And my blood ran cold. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. We were outside, but the terror didn't stop. In fact, it felt like the darkness had grown deeper, more oppressive. The air outside was cold, a biting chill that cut through me like the very hands of the night. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with the weight of the fear that still clung to me. Emma and I stood there on the front porch, staring back at the house. Our escape didn't feel like freedom. It felt like we were trapped in the middle of some nightmare we couldn't escape. The figure inside, the one who had been watching us, living in our basement, was still out there somewhere. What was that? Emma's voice trembled, barely above a whisper, as she looked toward the open door, her gaze flicking between the house and me. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was impossible. "But we can't stay here." I grabbed her arm, urging her to move away from the house, my mind racing with plans to leave, get in the car, drive as far as we could, and never look back. But something stopped me. The basement window. My eyes flicked to it, and my blood turned to ice. There, in the dim light of the house, I could see the outline of a face staring back at me. A pale face, eyes wide with an unnatural stillness. It wasn't just any face. It was his face. The one from the blurry photos. The one that had haunted the camera feed, the one that had no business being there. It was the face of someone who had been living in our home, moving through our walls, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves known. I felt my throat tighten as the realization hit me. The person we thought had been sneaking around, hiding in the house, wasn't just a random intruder. They were someone who had been here before, someone who had been watching us for much longer than we realized. I took a step back, pulling Emma with me. But the figure in the window didn't move. It didn't blink. It was like a statue, as though it wasn't quite real, but it was. "We need to call the police," Emma said, her voice cracking with fear. I didn't respond. My mind was already running through the possibilities. Was this person the same one who had been in the basement? Or had we only uncovered part of a much bigger secret? How long had they been living here? The unanswered questions were like a weight on my chest, growing heavier with every passing second. But as I reached for my phone, something caught my eye. The front door of the house creaked open again, and this time the figure stepped out. Slowly, deliberately. It was him, the same figure we had seen inside. But now, he wasn't standing still. He was moving toward us, one step at a time, dragging something behind him. The scraping noise from before. The same dragging sound. It was coming closer, like he was pulling something or someone. "Stay back," I hissed to Emma, but she didn't need to be told. We both backed away, but there was nowhere to go. We were on the porch, facing the street, but there was no car in sight. No escape. The figure continued his slow, deliberate advance. I could hear the rasping of his breath again, low and guttural. It filled the silence of the night, making everything feel unnervingly close. The darkness around us pressed in, thick and heavy, as though the world itself was closing in. We had no idea who this person was, or how long they had been living in our basement. But it didn't matter. We weren't safe anymore. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. We had to move. Fast. Run. I shouted to Emma, my voice hoarse with fear. We need to get out of here. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted, our feet pounding on the cold ground, our hearts racing in sync. But it was like the ground itself was working against us. My legs felt heavy, my breath ragged. No matter how fast we ran, it was never fast enough. I could hear him behind us, his dragging footsteps, getting closer, louder. We reached the end of the driveway, but there was still no sign of the car, no escape. The street was deserted, the houses around us dark and silent, as though the entire world had turned its back on us. I could feel him gaining on us. Closer. Closer. And then I heard it. A low, muffled laugh. It was cold. Empty. Like the laugh of someone who knew the game was over. The sound echoed in the night, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I whipped around, heart in my throat. But when I looked back, the figure had stopped. He stood still in the middle of the yard, watching us, his pale face glowing in the dim light. His eyes never left us. And that's when I saw it, the thing he was dragging. A bag. A large, black, heavy bag. I froze. It was unmistakable. The bag was moving, just slightly, as though it contained something, someone, that was still alive. "No," I whispered, my stomach dropping. "Please, no." But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, holding the bag, staring at us with those empty, hollow eyes. Emma gripped my arm, her voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. There was no escape, no way to outrun him. We were trapped in his world now, part of whatever twisted reality he had created. And I knew, in that moment, that we had made a terrible mistake. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The screams from the canyon. I had always loved the outdoors. There was something about the quiet, the vastness of nature that helped clear my mind. That's why I decided to take this trip with my friends, a weekend getaway into the remote canyons, far from the noise of the city. There were 5 of us, me, Sarah, Ben, Liz, and Jack. We'd been planning this for months. We packed light, hiked for a couple of days, and camped by the river. The sort of thing that felt both exhilarating and soothing at the same time. It was around mid-afternoon on the first day when we first heard the screams. At first, I thought it was just some wild animal, maybe a coyote or a mountain lion. But then the screams repeated, high-pitched, frantic. It was unmistakable. They were human. I froze, trying to make sense of it, and looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely able to speak. I nodded, still trying to convince myself that it was some kind of misunderstanding. We were in the middle of nowhere. This was a place people rarely visited. There was no way someone else could be out here, right? The others were already starting to look uneasy, all eyes scanning the rocky terrain that surrounded us. Jack, always the curious one, began walking toward the direction the screams had come from. "It's probably nothing," he said, but even his voice trembled with uncertainty. "Jack, don't," Ben started, but it was too late. Jack was already a few steps ahead of us. Against our better judgment, we followed him, our feet crunching on the gravel as we trekked through the canyon's rugged landscape. With each step, the air grew thicker, and the sounds of the canyon, crickets chirping, distant rustling in the brush, seemed to fade into an eerie silence. The further we went, the closer the screams seemed to get. The sound of a struggle was undeniable now, a mix of panic and desperation. Then we rounded a bend, and there it was. A clearing, bathed in sunlight, but the scene we saw was far from peaceful. There were signs of a violent struggle. The ground was disturbed, rocks and dirt scattered in every direction. There were deep gouges in the earth, as though someone had been dragged across it. A torn jacket lay discarded, and there were faint, bloody marks on the rocks, only faint enough to make it clear that someone had been hurt, badly. I felt my stomach twist, the sensation of dread pooling in the pit of my gut. I wanted to believe it was some kind of sick prank, but there were no signs of anyone being here, except for those marks and the occasional broken branch or crushed plant. No footprints. No body. "Where are they?" Sarah murmured, her voice almost lost in the wind. There were no answers. Only the chilling echoes of the screams still lingering in the distance, as though they were calling us deeper into the canyon, leading us into some trap we didn't understand. I looked around, my heart racing. We should leave. This isn't right. But Jack, ever the brave one, stepped closer to the ground, inspecting the bloody rocks. "Someone was definitely here," he said. "But where did they go?" The others stood in silence, each of us processing the bizarre scene in different ways. The canyon was beautiful, but it felt menacing now. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocks. We were alone in this desolate place, no one around for miles. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "We're not going to find anything here," Ben said, trying to stay calm. "We should head back. This doesn't feel right." I agreed. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The screams, the struggle, there was no explanation, no reason for any of it. But we couldn't stay here, not knowing what was lurking in the shadows. We began walking back to the trail, but the unease didn't lift. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds, as though expecting to see someone or something emerge from the canyon's depths. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing in on us. My thoughts raced. What had happened here? Had someone else been hurt, or worse, killed? None of us said anything, but I knew we all felt it, the weight of an unanswered question hanging over us, and the deep, gnawing fear that we were not alone. As we made our way back to the campsite, the cries had stopped. The canyon had returned to its usual, unsettling silence. But that didn't ease my mind. The screams still echoed in my head, growing louder with every step. We heard them, seen the aftermath, but where were the people who had been here? What had happened to them? And why did I feel like we were being watched, as though someone or something was still out there, waiting. The silence of the canyon seemed to follow us back to our campsite. We set up our tents in uneasy quiet, each of us processing the bizarre events of the afternoon in our own way. No one spoke about what we had seen, but the tension between us was palpable. The air felt different now, heavier, colder, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that the struggle we had found could be explained away as an accident or maybe a prank by other hikers. But deep down, I knew there was something more. The screams, the blood, the way the rocks had been torn apart, nothing about it felt right. As the sun began to set, the shadows lengthened, creeping across the landscape. The warm glow of the campfire flickered in front of us, casting dancing shadows on the walls of our tents. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, just friends, nature, and the stars. But the atmosphere felt wrong, like the darkness had already begun to settle in around us. We should check the cameras, Ben suggested, breaking the silence. He had set up a few motion-activated cameras along the perimeter of our campsite. His suggestion was more out of habit than concern, but as soon as he said it, a chill ran down my spine. The thought of reviewing the footage felt like we were preparing ourselves for something we didn't want to see. We gathered around Ben's laptop as he connected it to one of the cameras. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy view of the campsite from earlier in the day. The footage was uneventful at first, just the wind, the trees swaying, the occasional animal passing by. But then, something caught my eye. At around the time we had heard the first scream, the video showed a shadowy figure moving near the edge of the camp. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the darkness. But as I leaned closer, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't look like a person at all. It was too tall, too hunched, and it moved in a way that wasn't natural, more like a distorted shadow slipping through the trees. "Is that?" Sarah started, her voice trailing off as she watched the footage, her face pale. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure had been there long before we heard the screams, lurking in the shadows, watching us. We rewound the footage, hoping to catch more details. The figure seemed to appear and disappear, like it was blending into the trees, or maybe it was moving too quickly for the camera to capture clearly. But one thing was certain, it was there, and it had been watching us. "That's not normal," Jack muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. "We need to get out of here." But none of us moved. We all sat in stunned silence, watching the same few seconds over and over again, unable to tear ourselves away. The figure was a shadow, but it felt real. The hairs on my arms tingled as if the presence from the screen was still here, right beside us, lurking in the dark. We couldn't ignore it. The idea of someone, something, watching us, even in the relative safety of our campsite, felt suffocating. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a person? A hunter? But no, there was no way anyone could move like that, not without being caught by one of the other cameras. "We're not alone out here," Liz finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She sounded terrified, and I couldn't blame her. I felt the same. "We should stay together," I suggested, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. The canyon had become an unwelcoming place. I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me, the oppressive silence growing louder with every minute that passed. The rest of the night was a blur. We stayed huddled around the fire, the warmth of the flames providing little comfort against the growing unease that wrapped itself around us. We kept glancing into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. The figure from the camera had planted itself in all our minds. Each of us was thinking the same thing. What if it's still out there? But as the night wore on, nothing happened. The shadows of the canyon deepened, but the figure never reappeared. The fire crackled, the wind howled through the trees, and the night grew cold. I lay in my tent, unable to sleep. The sounds of the canyon seemed to twist and warp, growing louder as the wind picked up. I could hear the faintest whisper, almost like a voice, but it wasn't in any language I recognized. It was an eerie sound, like the wind itself was speaking. It chilled me to my core. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my mind racing with the possibility of what we had seen on the cameras. Was it just a trick of the light? A figment of our collective imagination? Or was something truly out there, waiting for us to make a mistake? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by one thing, but by something far larger and more dangerous. The canyon had always been an isolated place, but now it felt alive in a way that made every sound seem like a threat, every shadow like a lurking predator. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to silence my thoughts, but the screaming from earlier echoed in my mind, louder now, as if it were drawing closer, urging us to follow it deeper into the canyon. Tomorrow, we would have to face whatever this was. We had come this far, and we couldn't turn back now. But even as I tried to calm myself, I knew deep down that we were on the edge of something far darker than we could imagine. The morning light did nothing to ease the weight pressing down on me. I was the first to wake, my body stiff from a restless night. The silence of the canyon seemed deeper now, heavier. The campfire from the night before was nothing more than a pile of smoldering ash, but it was the shadows between the trees that caught my attention. They were darker than I remembered. I quickly got up, trying not to wake the others. Ben and Sarah were still asleep in their tents, their breathing steady but shallow. Jack had rolled over, pulling his blanket up to his chin, his face tense as if even in sleep he was still haunted by the events of yesterday. Liz stirred briefly, her eyes flicking open, then closing again as if she didn't want to face another day of this oppressive quiet. I grabbed a bottle of water, walking to the edge of our camp, scanning the surroundings. The air was still cold, the kind of chill that made the back of your neck prickle. The ground around us was untouched, nothing to indicate anyone had been near our tents since we arrived. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It was like the canyon itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned to head back to the tents when I saw it, a fresh trail of footprints leading from the edge of our camp toward the rocks. The tracks were unmistakable. They were large, not quite human in shape. I crouched down, studying them carefully. They were too deep to be from a deer, too spread out to be from a person. The marks were uneven, like someone or something had dragged itself across the dirt. My heart pounded. I looked back at the others, still asleep, oblivious to the danger lurking around us. Should I wake them now? Should we leave? I couldn't decide, but the thought of that thing being so close made my stomach churn. I stepped carefully over the tracks and moved toward the base of the rocks. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. It was as if the canyon itself was whispering my name. A sudden noise made me freeze. The faintest rustling. A twig snapping. I whirled around, scanning the trees. Nothing. The shadows danced with the wind, but there was no movement. My breath came in short bursts. I backed away slowly, making my way back to the camp, trying to calm myself. I wasn't alone. When I returned to the tents, everyone had begun to stir, groggy from a night spent in fear. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself before speaking. Guys, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There's something out there. Ben sat up first, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean, something? Like a person? No, I said, my throat tightening. Not like a person. Footprints, but they're not human. It's hard to explain. But something's been watching us. I think it's close. The others exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale and drawn from lack of sleep. Ben cursed softly under his breath, running a hand through his hair. We need to leave. Now, Jack said, his voice trembling with urgency. No, I stepped forward, trying to regain some control. We don't know what we're dealing with. If we leave now, we're walking straight into whatever this is. We need to stick together, stay close, and figure out what's happening. Liz, her face pale, spoke in a shaky voice. But we don't know what it is. What if it's not human? What if it's something else? I didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, I wasn't sure what we were dealing with either. But I had a sinking feeling that we had already crossed a line we couldn't come back from. We should check the area, I suggested, my voice low, steady, as though I could will myself to remain calm. Look for any more signs, any clues. And then we'll decide what to do. Ben, though reluctant, nodded in agreement. He pulled on his boots, glancing at the others. Stay close. No one gets separated. Got it? We all nodded in unison, the weight of what we were about to do settling heavily over us. We packed up what little we had left of our campsite, the eerie quiet making every sound seem amplified. The crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the sound of my own breath, ragged with fear. The canyon stretched out before us, vast and unforgiving. The shadows between the cliffs seemed to deepen as we moved forward, the air growing colder with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something much larger, something ancient and unknowable. As we approached the rocks where the footprints had led, I could feel the tension building, the air growing thick with fear. We moved cautiously, eyes darting between the rocks and the trees, ears straining for any sound. And then we heard it. A faint sound, carried by the wind, a scream. A long, drawn-out cry for help, filled with desperation and fear. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a person, or at least, it sounded like one. We exchanged terrified glances, our faces pale. But then something strange happened. The scream cut off abruptly, as if someone had shut it off mid-sentence. The silence that followed was worse than the scream itself. Ben swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. That wasn't right. I nodded, too scared to speak. The canyon had just swallowed someone whole. The question was, who? The trail we had been following, the one that led us to the rocks, suddenly seemed like a warning. We weren't supposed to be here. And whatever had made that scream, whatever had left those tracks, was still out there. Waiting. The air felt heavier now, thick with a sense of dread that weighed down on each of us as we stood at the edge of the canyon. The rocks around us seemed to close in, the narrow path winding further into the deep recesses of the land. I could barely hear the others' breaths. Each of us frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The scream that had pierced the air only moments ago still echoed in my mind, reverberating through the stillness like a haunting memory. The sudden silence that followed had felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ben shifted uneasily beside me, his eyes scanning the cliffside, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He was trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We had no idea what we were up against. None of us did. "We should go back," Liz said quietly, her voice trembling. "This isn't worth it. Something's wrong here." She was right, of course. We should turn back, pack up, and leave. But the fear of what was lurking in the shadows, of what had made that scream, held us there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too far in now. We had come this far, why stop now? "No," I said, more firmly than I intended. "We need to know what's going on. If someone is out there, if they need help." "Do you hear that?" Sarah interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. I froze, my eyes snapping toward her. A low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, seemed to come from the canyon's depths. The sound was so faint that for a moment I thought it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again. A deep, resonating growl, like something large and predatory was lurking in the shadows below. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't an animal we could recognize. It was something else, something unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness below. Whatever it was closer than we thought. "What is that?" Ben whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I muttered, my voice barely audible as I took a step back. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if the entire canyon might give way at any moment. "But I think it's time to go." Before I could say anything more, the ground beneath us shifted, a loud crack splitting the air. A moment later, the sound of scraping rock filled the silence, followed by a sharp, guttural hiss that sent a chill racing down my spine. We were not alone. In that instant, something emerged from the shadows, a figure, tall and hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was clothed in rags, skin pale and slick with what could have been sweat or something worse. The figure moved with terrifying speed, its limbs twisting at odd angles as it skittered toward us. A scream tore from my throat as I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. The others followed, but it felt as though we were too slow, like the creature was gaining on us with every heartbeat. We were trapped. There was nowhere to go. The canyon walls were too steep, the narrow path too winding. If we ran, we'd be running straight into its grasp. "Run!" I screamed, my legs moving on instinct as I turned and bolted down the path. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps pounding on the ground, their breath ragged with fear. The creature was close. I could feel it. Every step, every breath was a reminder that we were running out of time. I pushed myself harder, forcing my legs to carry me faster, praying that the end of the canyon was near. But the path seemed to stretch on forever, the walls pressing in on us. The growls behind us grew louder, more insistent, and I knew we couldn't outrun it. And then I heard it. A sickening, wet sound, the unmistakable noise of claws scraping against rock. I whipped around, just in time to see the creature emerge from the shadows, its eyes gleaming with malice, its mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. It was too late. I shoved Sarah ahead of me, pushing her out of harm's way as I tried to gain some distance. The others had fallen behind, panic setting in. Liz screamed, but the sound was quickly cut off, drowned by the roar of the canyon. I turned to help, but there was nothing I could do. I was trapped. We were all trapped. The canyon had become a maze, a labyrinth of stone that would consume us one by one. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. The growls faded, and the air grew deathly quiet once again. I couldn't bring myself to turn back. I couldn't bring myself to face what had happened to the others. The canyon had swallowed them whole. It had swallowed us all. And I was the last to hear the scream. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground, rooted by the terror that had claimed me. The silence was deafening now. Even the wind had ceased, leaving only the slow, uneven beating of my heart in my ears. Every breath felt shallow, ragged, as if the air itself had been stolen from me. Where had they gone? Liz, Ben, Sarah. They were just here. We were all running, and then nothing. No screams, no footsteps. Just the empty, suffocating quiet of the canyon. I was alone. I didn't know how much time passed before I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My feet dragged across the gravel, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had they vanished so suddenly? What had happened to them? I couldn't remember the last clear thought I had before everything blurred into chaos. But I had to keep going. I had to find them, or at least know what had happened. My mind kept screaming that it wasn't over, that there was still a chance. I stumbled through the canyon, my fingers brushing against the cool stone walls as I navigated the twisting path. The growl from earlier still echoed in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more my rational thoughts slipped away. Was it real? Or was it some kind of hallucination? The exhaustion, the fear, it was all starting to take its toll. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard something. A soft, distant whisper that seemed to carry on the wind. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, my desperation for answers manifesting in the form of faint murmurs. But no! There it was again, clearer this time, almost like a voice calling my name. John. I froze. My blood turned cold. That was my name. It came from deep within the canyon, from somewhere just ahead, around the next bend. I shouldn't have followed it. I knew that. The logical part of me screamed to turn back, to get out of the canyon before whatever had taken my friends could find me too. But something inside me, some primal instinct, pushed me forward. The whisper grew louder, closer. It was calling me, beckoning me. My feet moved against my will, each step a struggle, but I couldn't stop. The sound was like a drug, pulling me in, promising answers. I rounded the corner, and the world seemed to shift. The air thickened, the walls of the canyon closing in around me. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the canyon, facing away from me. Ben? I called out, my voice hoarse from panic. The figure didn't move. It stood still, unnervingly still, as if it was waiting for me. I called again, my voice breaking this time. Liz? Sarah? The figure slowly turned around, its face hidden in the shadow. As it faced me, a cold rush of realization swept through me. The figure wasn't one of them. It was someone, or something, else. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, hollow and empty. It smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was twisted, like the grin of something not meant to be seen by human eyes. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. Come closer. It wasn't a voice. Not really. It was a sensation, a presence in my mind, crawling under my skin, pulling me closer, urging me to come forward. And then, the ground beneath me shifted. A crack appeared in the canyon floor, wide enough to swallow a manhole. A deep, guttural noise, like a growl, but much deeper, more resonant, came from the depths of the canyon. The air seemed to thicken, and the very earth trembled. The figure stepped closer, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it approached me. Its voice was no longer a whisper, it was inside my head, drowning out all my thoughts. "Join us." The crack in the ground widened, revealing a dark abyss, an endless void that seemed to stretch into the very core of the earth. The figure's shadow seemed to spill into it, and I realized, with horror, that it wasn't just standing on the ground. It was part of the darkness itself. It had always been there, waiting. My mind raced for an escape, for anything that could save me. But there was nothing. No way out. I was already falling, spiraling into the abyss with no hope of ever returning. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was a voice, soft, almost kind. "Don't worry. You're not alone anymore." And then, nothing. No sound. No light. Only the crushing weight of the void. The canyon remained quiet, its ancient walls hiding secrets no one would ever uncover. In the distance, the faintest sound could be heard, a whisper on the wind, a call to anyone foolish enough to venture too close. And deep within the canyon, the figures watched. Always watching. Waiting for the next wanderer to get too close, to hear the whisper, to step just a little too far. The canyon had claimed more lives. And it would continue to claim more. Forever. The repair crew. I had been living in the house for years, but there was always something that needed fixing. The old windows, the creaky floors, the crumbling plaster, maintenance was a never-ending task. But with a full-time job, I just didn't have the time or the energy to tackle it all. So, when I saw the ad for a local repair crew, I decided it was time to call in some help. They promised quick, affordable service, nothing fancy, just a job done right. I dialed the number, and a friendly voice on the other end assured me that someone would be out the next morning. The morning came. The crew arrived on time, a group of 3 men, each with their own tools. They introduced themselves: Dave, the leader, Carl, a younger guy with a nervous energy, and Tom, who seemed to be the quiet one. They were all in their mid-30s, with the sort of unkempt appearance you expect from a group of men who had been working hard all morning. I showed them the areas that needed attention, the windows in the living room, a leak in the roof, and some of the floors that had started to sink. They nodded and immediately set to work. The sound of hammers and drills filled the house, a comforting noise at first, like a promise of progress. I decided to lead them to it, running some errands. I trusted that they'd take care of everything. The house was empty when I returned a few hours later, but the job was far from finished. There were tools scattered around, but no sign of the crew. The sound of silence was unnerving. At first, I thought they might have stepped out for lunch. Maybe they had to pick up some supplies, I reasoned. But as the minutes stretched into hours, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't like them to just leave in the middle of a job. I went to the back door to check if their truck was still parked outside. It was, but there was no sign of life. No movement. No voices. I waited a little longer, pacing around the house, my mind slowly beginning to race. What if something had happened to them? I tried calling the number I had dialed earlier, but the line was dead. The phone rang, but there was no answer. Panic started to seep into my thoughts. What if this was some kind of scam? What if I had let in people who weren't who they said they were? I ventured outside to check the truck, hoping for some sort of clue, but when I reached the driveway, I noticed something strange. The truck was locked, and there was no sign of any tools being packed away. Yet, I knew they had been working just an hour ago. The ground was littered with wood shavings, nails, and empty boxes. But the workers? They were gone, vanished. I walked back to the house, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and worry. What had happened to them? It didn't make sense. They had been there, right? They had worked all morning. Had they left for good, or was something worse at play? I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. I was overthinking things. There had to be a rational explanation. They probably just took off early. But something inside me kept whispering that something wasn't right. Then, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, nothing more than the house settling. But the sound came again, a distinct noise, like a footstep, soft but deliberate. I froze, listening. I was alone. The house was empty. The workers were gone. But there it was again. Another footstep, closer this time. I slowly turned towards the hallway, where the sound seemed to be coming from. My heart began to race. Had they come back? Were they inside? No, this wasn't right. No one had entered through the front door. The back door was locked, and the windows were secure. My legs felt heavy as I approached the dark hallway. The lights flickered once, twice, before coming back on. I walked cautiously, trying to steady my breath. I reached the living room, and that's when I saw it. The tools. They were scattered around, just as they had been earlier, but now they looked different. The hammer, the saw, the drill, they were all there, but they were in strange positions, almost as though they had been moved deliberately. The drill was placed perfectly in the center of the room, facing directly at me, as if someone had set it there, just for me to see. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. Where were the workers? Why had they left in such a hurry? And why was the house now so eerily still? I moved to the back door again, but this time I stopped. Something was wrong. The air felt colder. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, stretching farther than they should. A sense of dread washed over me, and I suddenly felt more alone than ever. That's when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, this time unmistakable and too close. And then, as if someone had been watching me all along, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't the only one left in this house. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps echoed once more, closer this time, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. My mind raced to rationalize what was happening. It had to be the wind, I thought. Maybe the house was settling, or there was some sort of natural sound bouncing through the walls. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right. The silence that followed the last step felt too thick, too unnatural. I glanced toward the back door again, my instincts telling me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. Something held me there, frozen in place, as if the house itself had a grip on me. I could still hear the faint echoes of footsteps, but they were different now, almost as if they were trying to surround me, coming from all directions. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they seemed alive with sound. My phone. I grabbed it from my pocket and tried calling the repair crew again. The line was still dead. Panic surged in me. I had to get out. But before I could make a move, a cold draft swept through the room. It wasn't coming from the open door. It was as if the very air in the house had shifted. The temperature had dropped several degrees in seconds. The walls groaned. I could hear it, feel it. The house was settling. Or was it something else? The sound wasn't like the creaks I was used to. It was deliberate. A warning. A shift. I took a step backward, trying to calm my shaking hands. And then I saw it. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the longer I looked, the more it became clear. The shadow. It stretched across the wall near the kitchen, long and unnaturally thin. It was as if something was standing just out of view, lurking in the darkness. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision. The shadow didn't move, it just stayed there, stretching in ways that didn't make sense, twisting unnaturally as if it was more than a shadow, something else entirely. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Could it have been a trick of the light? A reflection of something outside? But the light from the kitchen was weak, and nothing outside could have caused the distortion. I was alone. The workers were gone. The truck outside was empty. The silence around me was suffocating, yet there was this presence, watching me. I forced my legs to move, retreating toward the hallway, hoping to make it to the front door. But the moment I turned my back, the footsteps started again. They were heavier this time, more deliberate. Each step seemed to reverberate through the walls, vibrating in my chest. I couldn't make sense of it. I was alone in the house. I should be alone. And yet, the presence of someone or something else felt undeniable. The footsteps were getting closer. I reached the hallway and moved quickly, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the light switch. When the light flickered on, the house seemed to breathe with me. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes. But there was no one there. Just the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the slight creaks of the floorboards, and then I stopped. Something was different. The air was thicker now, heavier. It felt oppressive, as though the house itself was exhaling, pushing against me. My skin prickled, my breath shallow. The footsteps weren't just sounds anymore, they were vibrations. The walls felt like they were closing in. I backed up, my body moving instinctively toward the door. But when I looked down the hall, I saw it. The tools, the crew's tools, were now arranged in a circle on the floor. It wasn't random. The saw, the hammer, the nails, everything arranged as if someone had carefully placed them, forming a ring. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. In the center of the circle was something even more unsettling, a small puddle of dark liquid. It wasn't water, it wasn't clear. It was thick and black, like oil, but there was something in the way it reflected the light that made me uneasy. It seemed to move, shifting with a life of its own, as if it was waiting, watching. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move, but as I turned, I heard it, the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It was slow at first, the kind of movement you'd expect from someone trying to sneak up on you. But this wasn't a person. I had to get out. Now. I ran down the hallway, my hand gripping the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. But just as I pulled the door open, I stopped again. In the reflection of the window beside the door, I saw it. A figure. It was just behind me, standing in the shadows, watching. A man, or what looked like one, dressed in work clothes, but his face was blank. No expression. No features. Just a white void where a face should have been. I stumbled back, almost falling as I let go of the door handle. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it was waiting for something. It didn't need to speak, it was there, and that was enough. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't look away. Then, I heard the footsteps again, this time, behind me. Close. A voice whispered, low and distorted, "You're not leaving." I couldn't breathe. The whisper echoed in my ears, the words curling around my mind like smoke, suffocating me. "You're not leaving." My body froze in place, every instinct telling me to flee, yet I couldn't move. The figure was still standing in the window's reflection, its presence a weight I couldn't escape. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the door in front of me. The cold metal of the doorknob felt like it belonged to someone else's hand, not mine. The figure's eyes, if you could call them that, were like holes in a wall. Deep, empty, watching. A dull thud echoed behind me, closer than I expected. I whipped around, panic flooding through me. The hallway was empty. Nothing but the quiet, still air. But I could feel it. The pressure. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted. I wasn't alone. I turned back to the window, desperate to confirm what I had just seen. The figure was gone. But its absence didn't comfort me, it only made the silence more suffocating. My eyes darted to the floor, where the tools still lay in a perfect circle. The puddle of dark liquid in the center seemed to have grown, stretching out like a dark stain bleeding into the wood. The house creaked again, louder now, as if it was alive. Every breath I took felt heavier, more labored. I needed to get out, now. I had no explanation, no rational thought left. All I knew was that the house wasn't safe. It wasn't just the tools, the shadows, or the figure in the window. It was everything. With shaking hands, I pulled the door open wide, stepping into the yard. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, the coolness biting at my skin. I felt the weight lift off my chest for a second, but only a second. As I walked away from the house, my feet heavy on the gravel path, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone, something, following me. Nothing. I forced myself to keep walking, but the crunch of gravel beneath my boots felt louder than ever, a constant reminder of how alone I was. The truck was still parked in the driveway, empty as it had been when I first arrived. The lights of the street seemed so far away, distant and unreachable. And then, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were louder, more distinct, as though someone, or something, was walking just behind me, keeping pace. I didn't need to look to know that I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel the presence, the sensation of being stalked. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a sharp pain. I couldn't outrun it. I turned quickly, looking for a place to hide, but the yard was empty. The shadows from the trees stretched long, reaching for me like fingers in the dark. I could feel my legs trembling, the need to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Instead, I just stood there, frozen in place, listening. And then I heard it. A voice. Low. Familiar. Leave, now. It was a whisper, but it wasn't in the air. It was in my mind, inside my head, echoing like it was part of my own thoughts. I spun around again, half expecting to see the figure. But there was nothing. Only the darkness, stretching far beyond the reach of the porch light. I ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from that house. I could hear the footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the end of the driveway and turned onto the street, my legs burning, my chest tight. It was when I reached the main road that I stopped, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, only to find it still standing, dark and silent. The lights were out, the windows blank and empty, as though nothing had ever happened. But I wasn't convinced. The figure, the voice, the footsteps, they had all been real. I knew they had. I pulled out my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I opened the screen, I saw something that stopped me cold. The most recent message was from an unknown number. It was a photo. A picture of my front door. The one I had just left. But the image wasn't taken by me. I hadn't sent it. And in the corner of the photo, just at the edge of the frame, I saw a figure standing on the porch. A figure in work clothes. The same figure. I backed away from the phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. The message had been sent less than a minute ago. I was being watched. Before I could process anything more, the phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, the text was clear. Short. Simple. You can't leave. I couldn't breathe. The words on the screen seemed to blur in front of my eyes, spinning with my panic. You can't leave. The message was like a command, not a suggestion. The phone in my hand felt heavier, almost as if it were pulling me back toward the house. My legs refused to move, frozen to the spot, as if the very ground beneath me was holding me in place. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm myself. Rationality. I needed to think logically. Maybe this was some kind of prank. Maybe it was just a coincidence. There had to be an explanation. There were plenty of repair crews in the area. Maybe one of them had taken a photo of my house. Maybe the figure in the window had been a trick of the light. But my mind couldn't shake the image of that figure. The shadowy outline standing in the doorway, watching me with eyes that weren't eyes at all, just dark, hollow pits. I had to leave. I looked down the street. The houses seemed so far away now, so distant. I felt completely alone. The weight of the phone in my hand seemed to remind me that I wasn't. There was something out there, something that wanted me to go back. I turned and started walking again, though every instinct in me screamed to run. My feet were leaden, my body tense with every step. I didn't know why I was heading back, but I knew I was. It felt like a compulsion, an invisible force pushing me forward. As I neared the house, my eyes darted around. The streetlights seemed dimmer, casting long, eerie shadows. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. I stopped at the gate, my heart pounding. The front door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. Had I? I couldn't remember. A chill ran down my spine as I took a tentative step forward, my mind racing. I couldn't let myself be dragged into whatever this was. I had to find answers. I had to understand why everything had gone so wrong. The house was still, silent. But the silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The living room was just as I'd left it, furniture in place, the walls undisturbed. The air was thick with the scent of dust, stale and heavy. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the back of the house. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A shuffle. My breath caught in my throat. I walked toward the hallway, my feet dragging as if something was holding me back. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and it was then that I realized it wasn't just one shuffle, it was a series of shuffles, like footsteps in slow motion. Someone, something, was moving through the house. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the fact that the house felt wrong. It wasn't the same as before. It was darker, colder, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I stepped into the kitchen. The dim light flickered above, casting odd, jerky shadows across the floor. The work area was still there, half-finished, as if the crew had just left it moments ago. The tools lay scattered around, the half-tiled floor a testament to their sudden disappearance. But it wasn't just the unfinished work that unsettled me, it was the fact that everything, every last detail, felt too perfect. The kind of perfect that was unnatural, like it was waiting for something. The footsteps stopped. I froze in place, my breath shallow, waiting. For a moment, the house felt completely still again. And then the sound came. A loud thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. It came from upstairs. My pulse quickened. I couldn't stand here. I had to go. But my feet refused to move. I was rooted to the floor, every muscle in my body screaming for release. I'm not alone. The realization hit me with a sickening force. I needed to get out of the house. Now. But I didn't turn around. Instead, I slowly walked toward the stairs, the sound of my steps blending with the eerie quiet of the house. I could feel something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The door to the attic was open. I don't remember opening it. I don't remember ever going up there. But the stairs were there, leading up to the darkness. And in that darkness, I heard it. A whisper. We've been waiting for you. The words were low, almost a hum, and they vibrated through my bones. I couldn't tell if they came from inside the attic or if they were in my head. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped toward the stairs. The pull was stronger now, the sensation of being drawn into something I couldn't understand. Something ancient. Something ombre. The whisper came again, louder now, unmistakable. Come. I turned, my body finally obeying, and sprinted for the front door. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I ran out into the night, my breath ragged, heart thudding in my chest. The streetlights flickered behind me, casting long, twisted shadows. But I didn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I had to get away from the house. From them. I didn't even know who they were. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That somehow, it had just begun. I don't remember how long I ran. My legs burned, my breath came in shallow gasps, and my mind raced with every possible explanation I could muster. But none of them made sense. The whisper had been so real, so close. The feeling of eyes on my back, the unrelenting sense of being followed, hadn't faded. I wasn't just being paranoid. I knew something had changed. Something had awakened in that house. Something that wanted me there. I stumbled onto the main road, my hands gripping my phone tightly as I looked around, disoriented. It was dark, the night cold and unforgiving, but the street was eerily silent. No cars passed by, no one seemed to be around. The world felt suspended, as if I was the only person left in it. I pulled out my phone, half expecting to see more messages or missed calls. But there was nothing. Only the last one, "You can't leave." I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I even go back and check the house? I didn't want to go back. I knew what I'd find, but I had to know for sure. I turned around, slowly walking back toward the house. Every step felt heavier, the air colder. It was as if the universe itself was trying to stop me from going back, but I couldn't help it. My feet moved of their own accord, pulling me closer to that place I should never have returned to. When I reached the house, I stopped. The lights inside were on, but everything else was still. No cars in the driveway, no sound. The front door, wide open, beckoned me. I had no choice. I stepped inside once more. The house was exactly as I had left it, eerily silent, the half-finished work still there. The tools were scattered around, just as the crew had left them, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive. My senses were on edge, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with each passing second. I didn't go upstairs. I couldn't. Instead, I walked slowly through the house, my feet shuffling across the wooden floor. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but no explanation felt right. No logic applied. This wasn't normal. The footsteps were gone. The whispers had stopped. But I could still feel them. The kitchen door creaked. I froze. Someone was behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air grew colder, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I glanced over my shoulder. There was no one there. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe everything had just been a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't empty. I stepped toward the back door and opened it, the chill of the night air rushing in. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. I stepped outside, but the moment my foot hit the ground, something stopped me. My gaze drifted to the far corner of the yard. The shed. The shed that I had never paid attention to before. It was small, tucked away behind the house, half hidden by a thicket of trees. But tonight, it seemed to draw me in, like a magnet. I felt compelled to move toward it, my body no longer in control of my actions. The closer I got, the darker it seemed to get. As if the shed was swallowing the light. Something was inside. I approached slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped closer. The door was slightly ajar, but I didn't hesitate. My hand reached out, trembling, and I pulled the door open. Inside was a small table, cluttered with old papers, tools, and strange symbols drawn in chalk. But that wasn't what stopped me. What stopped me was the figure standing in the far corner of the shed. A person. Or at least, what looked like a person. They were tall, thin, and hunched over. Their back was to me, but I could see the outline of their body in the dim light. The figure didn't move. It didn't even breathe. My stomach dropped. I stepped backward, my mind racing. Who was this? Why were they here? What were they doing? I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. Then the figure turned around. Their face was pale, too pale, and their eyes were hollow, black pits. I could see nothing but darkness in those eyes. No pupils, no reflection, just emptiness. The air around me grew colder, and for a split second, I thought I saw the faint outline of the repair crew standing behind the figure. The crew. The ones who had disappeared. The figure stepped forward, the sound of their movement unnervingly slow, as if they were savoring every second. Every step. My breath caught in my throat as they drew nearer, and with each step, I felt myself losing control. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something worse. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me to step inside the house. Waiting for me to open the door. It reached out a hand. I couldn't run. My feet wouldn't move. But I knew one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure's hand reaching for me. And then nothing. The last call. It was close to midnight when I received the call. The voice on the other end was barely audible, the words slurred as if spoken from a distance. "I need a ride," the voice said. "Forest Road. Now." I glanced at the GPS, but the address wasn't anywhere near the main roads. The route seemed to wind its way into the woods, a secluded area I didn't recognize. It wasn't an area I normally drove through, especially at night. But a job was a job, and I wasn't about to turn down a fare, no matter how strange the request. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine as I started the engine. The night was cold, and the streets were eerily empty. No cars, no people. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the winding path that led toward the woods. The road grew narrower as I ventured deeper into the forest. The trees closed in, their branches swaying and creaking in the wind. The GPS showed I was getting closer, but there was nothing ahead but dense woods and an endless stretch of road. I glanced at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me, but it was only darkness. The silence seemed almost suffocating, and the further I drove, the more I felt like something wasn't quite right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a faint whisper of doubt began to creep into my mind. I reached the spot where the GPS indicated the passenger should be, but there was nothing, no car, no sign of anyone. The only thing I could see was a stretch of trees, their dark shadows looming over the road. I stopped the car, rolling down my window to listen. The sound of the forest was deafening in its silence. "Hello?" I called, leaning out of the window. Nothing. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages. My gut told me I should leave. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But then again, I had a job to do. I waited a few more minutes, but no one showed up. I glanced at the address again. It had been sent from a local number, but the strange part was that the area code didn't match. It was from far beyond the region I usually worked in. I was about to start the engine and leave when I heard it, a faint tapping, like a knock on glass, coming from the back seat. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. I leaned back in the seat, forcing myself to calm down. It was just the wind, or maybe the trees rubbing against the car. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was off. I pulled the door handle and got out, my footsteps crunching on the gravel as I looked around. "Is anyone here?" I called out again, louder this time. A shiver ran down my spine when I heard a voice, muffled but clear this time. "I'm waiting." I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. The words came from nowhere, their source untraceable. I don't know why I stayed. It was like something was keeping me there, something beyond my control. I looked back at the car, the emptiness inside it unsettling, and took a few slow steps toward the woods. My eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing but shadows and rustling leaves. Suddenly, the voice came again, louder this time. "I'm right here." I spun around, but there was still no one there. I didn't even hear the footsteps at first. It was only when I turned back toward the car that I saw it. The back seat of the car, which had been empty just moments ago, now had a shadowy figure sitting there. My heart froze in my chest. The figure was slumped over, face hidden by the shadow. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by fear. I couldn't move. I forced myself to step forward, cautiously approaching the car. My hand hovered over the door handle. As I reached for it, the figure slowly turned its head toward me. The face, or what was left of it, was pale and gaunt, with empty, hollow eyes staring straight at me. Its lips parted slightly, as though to speak. I could hear the faintest breath, but the words that followed weren't clear. "Go," it whispered. I froze. The car doors slammed shut with a sudden gust of wind, and I jumped back in shock. The figure disappeared, leaving behind only the cold air and a lingering feeling of dread. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Something had gone wrong. The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Go, before it's too late." I didn't think twice. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, not daring to look back. The road behind me was empty, silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that had been there all along, waiting in the dark. The night seemed to stretch on forever as I made my way back to the main road, the sense of unease never leaving me. By the time I reached a familiar streetlight, I thought I might be safe. But I wasn't. I wasn't sure what I had seen or who that figure was. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold, the same face, just beyond the glass, staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't know how I made it home. But I do know one thing. I'll never take another call like that again. The next morning, I woke up in a cold sweat, the remnants of the previous night's events still lingering in my mind. The face, those empty eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too real. I kept telling myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind brought on by the solitude of the road. But I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. I tried to put it out of my mind as I prepared for my next shift. The usual sounds of the city filled the air, cars honking, people chatting as they walked by, the hum of distant machinery. But it all felt distant, as though I were standing behind a thick glass window. The events of the night before played over and over in my head like a haunting melody I couldn't escape. I grabbed my keys, heading to the garage to pick up the cab. I wasn't sure if I should even be driving today, but the bills needed to be paid, and the urge to shake off the unease was stronger than my fear. Besides, I had a responsibility to keep working. I got into the car and started the engine, but the moment I did, the radio crackled to life, the static buzzing in my ears. It was odd. Usually, the radio worked fine. I fiddled with the dials, but the static remained until, suddenly, it cut out and the familiar, clear voice of a dispatcher came through. Driver 324, there's a call waiting for you. Same location as last night. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The same location? I didn't even remember submitting the shift details for the night before. No one knew about where I had been, except for me. My mind raced. How could they possibly know? Before I could respond, the dispatcher continued, Driver 324, do you copy? Your pickup is at Forest Road again. Please confirm you're en route. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tight. There was no way I could go back there, not after last night. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I considered just turning off the engine and heading home. But the thought of abandoning another shift gnawed at me. I wasn't a quitter. I'm on my way, I muttered, my voice barely audible, even to myself. The drive felt different this time. The road that had once seemed like a simple route to an ordinary destination now felt like an open wound, a scar I couldn't erase. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, that I was overthinking things. But with every mile I drove, the air felt heavier, more suffocating. As I neared Forest Road again, the GPS directed me to the same eerie spot. I slowed, my pulse quickening. There were no streetlights here, just the hollow, oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. I stopped the car at the same spot where I had been the night before. It was the same, but different somehow. The silence was thicker, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled the brake and sat still, listening. Nothing. The voice from last night, the voice in the car, it still echoed in my ears. Go, before it's too late. A faint tapping against the back window broke the silence. I turned around quickly, but there was no one in the back seat. The interior of the cab was empty, just as it had been last night. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I looked out the rear window, expecting to see someone standing there, but all I saw were the twisted shadows of the trees. Hello? I called out nervously, my voice barely steady. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, everything went silent again. Then, I heard something else, a low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The growl was gone, but the feeling of dread settled deeper in my bones. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to see what was coming next. I slammed the car into reverse and sped away, my heart racing as I tore down the narrow road. The trees blurred by as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. Nothing. I made it back to the main road, my hands trembling on the wheel. I couldn't explain what was happening, why the same place, the same sounds, were all coming back. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. But the worst part? The part that made my stomach churn and my skin crawl? I couldn't remember how long I'd been sitting in that spot, or how I had even gotten back to the main road. The minutes, the hours, everything blurred into one long stretch of panic. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to steady myself. My hands were slick with sweat, my head pounding. Something wasn't right. And whatever it wasn't over. The rest of the shift was uneventful, but the fear lingered. My mind kept replaying the growl, the tapping, and the voice. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. When I got home, I checked my phone again. Still no messages, no missed calls, no indication of why I had been summoned to that spot. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. An unread message sent from an unknown number. "Do you remember me?" I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't seen the number before, but those words sounded too familiar. Before I could process it, another message came through. "Your ride is waiting." The message was followed by a picture. It was the back seat of a taxi, eerily empty. I threw my phone across the room in a panic, my mind racing. There was no way I was going back to that road, not after what had happened. I sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. And then I heard it again, the tapping. It was coming from my front door. The tapping continued, sharp and rhythmic against the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, not sure if I was hearing things or if it was real. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the wall, trying to steady my breath. "Who's there?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding small, almost inaudible in the stillness of the room. No answer. Only the relentless tapping. I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, as if they were bound by some invisible force. The sound was unnerving, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to make the first move. I slowly made my way to the window, my eyes darting around the front yard, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the house now. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway. But the house was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts running wild in my mind. It was just my nerves, I told myself. The events of the past few days had taken a toll, and now my mind was playing tricks on me. But something deep inside told me it wasn't over. That something was still out there, something I couldn't escape. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy lamp, and moved cautiously toward the door. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was like everything had gone still, waiting. I took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob. As soon as my hand touched it, the door flew open, almost as if it had been waiting for me to make the first move. I staggered backward, my heart skipping a beat. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. The front steps were empty, the only trace of anyone being the faintest smudge in the dust by the doorframe. I stepped outside, my mind racing, the air colder than it should have been for a spring night. The shadows around the yard seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were alive, moving closer. I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the doorway remained empty, as silent and still as the rest of the house. I turned back toward the street, my pulse quickening. Every instinct told me to run, to get in the car and drive far, far away from this place. But my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was closing in on me. Then I heard it, the soft, familiar hum of a car engine in the distance. My eyes snapped to the road, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the unmistakable sound of a taxi. My taxi. Before I could process what was happening, the car appeared at the end of the street, headlights cutting through the darkness. But it wasn't driving past. It stopped. Right in front of my house. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart hammering in my chest. The car remained perfectly still. No movement. No sound. Then, the door of the taxi opened. I didn't see anyone step out. But I felt it, an overwhelming presence, like something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. My skin prickled, and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone. But again, there was no one. The door to the taxi slammed shut. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back to the taxi. I couldn't let whatever was out there, whatever was playing this twisted game, get any closer. But my legs moved of their own accord. I took a step, then another, until I was standing in front of the taxi. The door was wide open, the interior empty, the faint smell of cologne and leather filling the air. It looked exactly the same as it had the night before, the same dull fabric on the seats, the same yellow glow from the streetlights outside. I leaned into the car, my breath shaky. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Nothing. The only sound was the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees and the quiet hum of the city in the distance. My hand hovered over the seat, unsure of what to do. But then something caught my eye, a small object on the floor, half hidden by the seat. I bent down to pick it up. It was a driver's license. My blood ran cold as I stared at the picture on the ID. The face was unfamiliar, but the name made my stomach twist. It was me. I dropped the license as if it had burned me. The car door slammed shut behind me, making me jump. I turned around quickly, but the street was empty. The taxi, the license, everything gone in the blink of an eye. I was alone. But I wasn't. Not really. I could feel it, an unseen presence watching me from the shadows, from somewhere I couldn't see, but could feel deep within my bones. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, in the distance, I heard it again, the familiar hum of a taxi engine. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from the forest. And I knew, deep down, that I would have to face it. Whatever was out there, waiting for me. Whatever had been calling me this whole time. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the sound. And I never looked back. The further I walked into the forest, the colder the air became, the weight of silence pressing down on me. The distant hum of the taxi engine, once just a faint sound, now felt almost like it was vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The darkness swallowed everything, making the trees seem like looming shadows that were closing in, suffocating any remaining hope. Each step I took felt heavier, like something was pulling me toward it. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, rapid and loud in my ears, as I made my way through the underbrush. My breath was shallow, visible in the cold night air. The leaves crunched beneath my feet, every step like a drumbeat in the silence. But there was something else too. A soft scraping, almost like nails on metal, just out of reach. I froze, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the rustling of the trees, the whispering wind. And then I saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like the glow of headlights. The taxi. It was parked in a small clearing ahead, its headlights illuminating the mist that clung to the ground. The car was motionless, like it had been waiting for me all this time. I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run as fast as I could. But I couldn't. Something was compelling me forward, like a pull from deep within the pit of my stomach. I had to see this through, whatever it was. I had to know. The car was identical to the one I had seen earlier, parked by the side of the road. Same yellow paint, same darkened windows, but there was something off about it now. The stillness, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, made it feel less like a car and more like a part of the night itself. I stepped closer, my feet dragging on the cold ground. The fog seemed to swirl around my ankles as if it was trying to hold me back. I reached the driver's side and peered inside. The seat was empty. I leaned in, my heart pounding in my chest. The back seat was the same as before, empty, except for something strange on the floor. A crumpled piece of paper. I reached for it, my hand trembling. I unfolded the paper, and as I did, a chill ran down my spine. It was a photograph of me. The image was dark, blurry, but unmistakably me, standing on the side of the road, the night wrapping around me like a shroud. It had been taken just hours ago, but it felt like it had been taken a lifetime ago. I swallowed hard, my stomach churning as I realized the implications. How had they gotten this picture? How could they have known where I would be? Then I heard it again. The soft scrape. Closer this time. Not in the distance, but right behind me. I spun around, the breath knocked out of me as I came face to face with the figure. The tall, slender figure, its features obscured by the shadows. The air around it seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. It wasn't human, not in any sense I could comprehend. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it staring at me, watching me. And I knew, deep down, that it had been waiting for me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat closed up, my body frozen in terror. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't escape. The figure took a step toward me, its limbs unnaturally long, its movement jerky and disjointed. It was impossibly close now. And just as I thought it would reach out for me, its form flickered, like a bad signal on old television. For a brief moment, it was no longer there. And then, it was gone. I was left standing in the clearing, gasping for air, my body trembling with the aftermath of whatever had just happened. The taxi was still there, its headlights burning brighter than ever, but the figure was gone. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. The photo was still in my hand, the image of me frozen in time. My own reflection, but not in the way I remembered it. My face was twisted, contorted in fear. But it wasn't just fear. It was something darker. Something I couldn't put into words. I turned away from the taxi and started to walk back toward the road, my legs unsteady beneath me. I couldn't look at the clearing again. I couldn't stand to see it, to face whatever it was that had been waiting for me. But as I walked, the sound of the taxi engine filled the air once more. The hum grew louder, as if it were following me, its presence lingering behind me, like a shadow. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the car there, but there was nothing. Nothing except the sound. The relentless, persistent hum of the engine. I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It was just beginning. The taxi wasn't going anywhere. And neither was I. The trees blurred around me as I walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold air bit at my skin, the fog clinging to the ground, making everything look indistinct and unreal. The silence of the forest seemed to press in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hum of the taxi's engine was always just behind me, like an invisible force that refused to let me go. It never wavered, never slowed, just constant. A sound I couldn't escape. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the sound, trying to outrun it, but it stayed with me. Closer now, almost like it was inside my head. I glanced around, but there was nothing. The forest was empty, save for the shadows and the trees that stood like silent sentinels. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching out into the night like a dark, unfeeling ribbon. I kept walking, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. The photograph, the figure, the strange sensation of being hunted. I kept coming back to one thought: there was no escape. Whatever was chasing me wasn't going to stop until it had me. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to my knees. The hum of the taxi's engine grew louder, and I felt it in my chest now, vibrating through my ribs. The ground beneath me felt soft and shifting, as if the earth itself was breathing, shifting, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as the world around me seemed to stretch, warp, and change. A low, mechanical sound broke through the hum, the unmistakable sound of a car door creaking open. I jerked my head toward the sound, and there it was, the taxi. It had appeared out of nowhere, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin beacons of doom. The car was parked on the side of the road, but something was wrong. The door was ajar, the seat empty. And yet, I could feel its presence, like a hand on the back of my neck, urging me toward it. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to go closer. I didn't want to get in. But I knew, deep down, I had no choice. This was where it wanted me. I stood up, my legs shaking as I moved toward the car. The fog thickened around me, and with each step, I felt more disoriented, like the forest was swallowing me whole. I reached the taxi, my hand hovering over the door handle. I didn't touch it, not yet. I needed to know if there was anyone inside. Anyone to explain what was going on. I peered into the back seat, my eyes searching through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I looked toward the front seat. The same empty darkness. And then, I saw it. A figure, reflected in the rearview mirror. A face, pale and distorted, staring right back at me. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, but my feet refused to move any further. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the sight. It wasn't just a reflection, it was me. Or at least, it looked like me. But the eyes, they were wrong. Empty. Hollow. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I needed to call for help. I needed someone to explain this, to make it stop. But as I looked down at the screen, I saw the time. It read the same hour it had been when I first got the call. The same minute, the same second. It couldn't be. I tried to dial, but the screen flickered and went black. The taxi's engine hummed louder, growing into a deafening roar, filling my mind. And then, a voice. A soft whisper, coming from the car's interior, cold and chilling. Get in. I snapped my head around, searching for the source, but there was no one. Nothing. The voice was just there, hanging in the air. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for me. I backed away from the taxi, panic flooding my chest. I turned, intending to run, but something caught my leg. I looked down, roots, vines, thick and snaking around my ankle, pulling me toward the car. I screamed, pulling at the vines, but they only tightened, dragging me closer. Get in, the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. With a final, desperate effort, I wrenched myself free, stumbling back onto the road. I could hear the engine revving now, the car shaking as if it was alive and angry. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The road ahead seemed to stretch forever, the forest closing in behind me. The air felt thick, suffocating, like I was breathing underwater. And no matter how fast I ran, the sound of the taxi, its engine, its hum, its presence, followed me, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. It was never going to stop. I had no idea how long I had been running. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, if I turned around, whatever that thing was would have me. It would consume me. Finally, my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The fog had thickened so much now that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the dirt, the marks of where I had fallen, but there was nothing. My skin was clean. Too clean. I looked up, my mind racing with panic. The road was gone. The trees had disappeared, replaced by a thick, featureless blackness. I was surrounded by nothing. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The taxi, its headlights glowing like two eyes in the dark, was waiting for me. And I knew it wasn't going to let me go. The stranger in the mask. It was the start of the pandemic, and everything felt different. The world was quieter, more distant, as if a heavy fog had settled over everyday life. People walked with their heads down, eyes avoiding contact, lost in the noise of their own fears. I had become accustomed to it all, wearing my mask like everyone else, but something about the isolation felt wrong. I remember it clearly, the first time I saw him. It was a Wednesday evening, the store almost empty as I walked down the aisle, picking up a few things I needed. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights above, the soft shuffle of feet on the linoleum, was all that could be heard. It was a familiar sound now, one that I had grown used to over the last few months. The pandemic had made shopping feel like a routine of survival, a necessary chore with a constant undercurrent of anxiety. I was turning the corner near the dairy section when I first saw him. At first, I thought it was just another shopper. He was wearing a mask, just like everyone else. But something about the way he stood there, still as a statue, caught my attention. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing there, his gaze fixed somewhere distant. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But then, I noticed his eyes. They weren't just staring ahead, they were scanning the aisles, darting from one person to the next. It was subtle, but it was there. A slow, deliberate observation, as if he was waiting for something. For someone. And as soon as I saw it, I couldn't look away. I moved a little to the left to avoid being directly in his line of sight, pretending to focus on the yogurt in front of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were still on me. It was like he was watching me, studying me, waiting for me to make a move. I glanced back up at him, but by then, he was gone. Disappeared, as if he had melted into the air itself. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe I had just seen someone who looked like him. But something in my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't until I was standing in line to check out that I realized there was no one else around. I hadn't seen him leave the store. I hadn't heard his footsteps, his cart rolling, or any sound at all. He had vanished into thin air. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just paranoid. The pandemic had made everyone more on edge. But deep down, I couldn't forget the image of his face, the way his eyes had locked onto mine. There was something off about him, something that didn't sit right. As I left the store and walked to my car, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching from the shadows. But I didn't. I thought about it all the way home. It had to be my imagination. People were on edge, and I was no different. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then, when I got inside and checked my phone, I saw the news. A story from another city, almost identical to mine. A man, seen in a mask, appearing in stores and vanishing without a trace. A shadow in the crowd, gone before anyone could react. I shuddered. Maybe it wasn't just my imagination after all. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, replaying the image of the man's eyes, the unsettling feeling that had washed over me. The idea that I wasn't the only one who had seen him, that others had experienced the same thing, was even more terrifying. What did he want? Why was he appearing? What was the point of it all? The next day, I went about my routine, trying to forget. But the thought of the man, the stranger in the mask, haunted me. Little did I know that would not be the last time I saw him. The days that followed felt like an endless loop. Every time I went to the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there, watching from the corners, slipping through the aisles like a ghost. At first, I convinced myself it was just a one-time occurrence, my mind playing tricks on me. But then, as more reports surfaced, I began to wonder. People were talking about him, though no one had seen him clearly enough to give a full description. All they knew was that he appeared in the same way, always silent, always watching, and always vanishing without a trace. Some claimed he was a product of the pandemic, a reflection of everyone's anxiety and paranoia, but there was something in the air, something unsettling about the stories that kept circulating. At night, I could feel the weight of the fear settling into my bones. It wasn't just about the virus anymore. It was about this presence. The idea of a man who appeared without reason, who observed people and then disappeared, left me with a constant sense of unease. What was his purpose? Why target the lonely, isolated shoppers, those already struggling with the weight of the world on their shoulders? I tried to tell myself that it was just a rumor, something born out of the collective stress of the pandemic. But every time I stepped foot in the store, I would glance nervously at the aisles, hoping I wouldn't catch a glimpse of him. The mask, the hidden eyes, always lingering in my mind. I couldn't shake it. One evening, I decided to stop by the supermarket after work. I was running low on food, and it was getting late. I tried not to think about the man as I parked and walked inside. The usual hum of the store was deafening in its silence. The shelves, stocked with canned goods and cleaning supplies, were lifeless, their fluorescent lights flickering above. I moved down the aisles quickly, grabbing what I needed, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. But every few steps, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. It happened again. I turned the corner into the bread section, and there he was. His back was to me, but the mask was unmistakable. I froze for a moment, not daring to move. His presence was oppressive, like a heavy weight in the air. He stood still, completely silent, as if waiting for something or someone. For a few moments, I stood in the aisle, trying to breathe quietly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe this was just my imagination again. But then, he moved. Slowly, methodically. His head turned just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his profile. His eyes were hidden behind the mask, but I could feel them. They were on me, watching me. And just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished into the next aisle, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence. I stood there, frozen. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the aisle around me. There was no one else in sight. The shelves, once full of products, now felt cold, empty. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had seen him, but the store was as quiet as it had been when I first walked in. I hurried to the checkout, my hands shaking as I placed my items on the conveyor belt. The cashier barely glanced at me, his eyes tired and vacant. Everyone seemed to be on edge, lost in their own world. I paid quickly and left, my breath shallow as I stepped back into the night air. I couldn't stop thinking about him. What was he doing? Why did he keep appearing? I tried to reason with myself, to make sense of it all. Maybe he was just some strange person who liked to mess with people, who liked to watch the frightened and confused faces of those trapped in this endless crisis. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Something darker. As I drove home, my mind raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but no one was behind me. Still, the sensation lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. What if he was watching me right now, following me from a distance? I pulled into my driveway, barely able to focus on parking. The house was dark, too quiet. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, the sense of dread intensifying. But it wasn't over. Not yet. That night, as I lay in bed, the same thought kept replaying in my mind. I wasn't the only one who had seen him. And if that was true, then something much worse was coming. The days felt like they were stretching on endlessly, but the incidents continued to haunt me. The man in the mask wasn't just a fleeting presence anymore. It was as if the whole town was talking about him, everyone had seen him, everyone was terrified. Some believed he was part of the government surveillance, others speculated he was a symptom of some sort of collective psychological breakdown. But for me, the explanation didn't matter. I knew he was real. The supermarket visits had become torturous. Every time I walked through those automatic sliding doors, I couldn't help but scan every aisle, every corner. Was he watching me again? I couldn't tell. He was like a shadow, always lurking just out of sight. And then, just when you thought he had disappeared, he would emerge again, silent, still, his eyes behind that mask, studying you. But what really shook me was what happened next. It was late one night, almost closing time. The store was unusually quiet. I moved through the aisles quickly, trying to get my shopping done before the overwhelming sense of unease consumed me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned a corner into the canned food aisle, and there, just at the end of the row, I saw him. This time, he wasn't moving. He was standing still in the shadows at the far end, his body turned slightly toward me, his face hidden behind that same plain mask. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. But I didn't run. There was something about the stillness of the moment that paralyzed me. I had to know. I had to see if this was truly him, or if my mind was playing tricks again. I took one step forward, then another, my eyes never leaving his figure. But just as I was about to reach the end of the aisle, the man, he turned, without a sound, and walked away. I moved instinctively, following him at a distance, my mind racing. This was it. This was the moment I would finally confront him. I rounded the corner, my heart pounding in my ears, and found the aisle empty. The silence was deafening. I felt dizzy, almost as if the air itself had thickened. Had I imagined it all? Was this some bizarre dream? No. There was no way. I had seen him. I knew I had. I glanced around, the shelves around me seeming to close in. My hands shook as I clutched my cart. I had to get out of there. I needed to get out. But then, a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered from behind me. Leave. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The man in the mask was standing right behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, and he was closer than I'd ever seen him before. The mask, cold and emotionless, seemed to mock me, reflecting the harsh store lights. He didn't move, didn't speak again. He just stood there, eyes hidden, watching. Please, I whispered, backing away. I don't know what you want. Just leave me alone. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned and began walking toward the back of the store. I hesitated for only a second before following him, my legs feeling like lead as I moved through the aisles, trying to catch up. He reached the back door of the store, and before I could make a sound, he slipped through it, vanishing into the darkness outside. I didn't follow. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I couldn't understand. What did he want? Why was he doing this? I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my things, checked out, and left. The cold night air felt almost suffocating as I walked to my car, still unable to shake the image of the man's mask from my mind. When I got home, I locked all the doors and shut all the windows, but sleep wouldn't come. The events of the night kept replaying in my head, over and over. I tried to tell myself that he wasn't real, that I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't just seeing him. He was watching me. And he wasn't done yet. The next morning, I woke to a strange sensation, a feeling of being watched. I looked out the window. The streets were empty, still. I tried to shake the unease, but it clung to me. Something was coming. I could feel it. And I had no idea how to stop it. The day was heavy with unease, each second dragging by like a thick fog that refused to lift. I had to return to work, but the thought of walking back into that same supermarket, knowing he might be there, made my skin crawl. The town was quieter than usual, everyone in some sort of anxious, subdued state. We had all heard the rumors, stories about the masked man creeping around, and some even whispered about the strange disappearances that seemed to follow him. I didn't know what to believe anymore. But what I did know was that I couldn't let him keep haunting me. I couldn't let fear dictate my life. By the time I arrived at the supermarket that evening, I had steeled myself for whatever awaited. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but I refused to let it control me. I had work to do. But as soon as I entered, the store felt different. The air was thick, charged with an unsettling tension. It wasn't just the usual dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead or the low chatter of people around. There was something wrong. The aisles were nearly empty, just a few shoppers scattered here and there, but my eyes couldn't help but dart from one corner to another, searching for him. Had he returned? I made my way down the produce aisle, trying to focus on my task, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned to grab a bag of apples, and that's when I saw him. At the far end of the aisle, standing perfectly still, was the man in the mask. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just standing there as he usually did. His posture was more rigid, his presence more pronounced. It was as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to remain calm. My body trembled, but I forced myself to take slow, deliberate steps, moving as though I hadn't noticed him. But the moment my foot touched the ground, I heard it, a slight creak, like a soft whisper in the air. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. The man didn't move. He didn't acknowledge me, but somehow, I knew he was aware of me. His gaze, though hidden behind that mask, seemed to follow my every movement. I kept walking, determined to avoid making eye contact, but my mind was racing. Was I going crazy? Was this real? Or was it my paranoia making things worse? I turned the corner quickly, looking over my shoulder, but the aisle was empty again. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that I had imagined it. But when I reached the checkout line, I saw him again. This time, he was standing by the exit. His hands were at his sides, and his stillness was unnerving. The sense of dread grew heavier as I reached the self-checkout. I felt the weight of his presence like 1,000 eyes pressing into my back. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to turn and leave before he could catch me, but I had to face this. I couldn't let it control me. With shaking hands, I scanned my items quickly, avoiding his gaze, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing at him as I finished. He was still there, unmoving, just watching. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. It wasn't a power outage, but a glitch, an unnatural flicker that made the air seem colder, more oppressive. I felt a chill down my spine as I watched the lights flicker again, and in that brief moment of darkness, the masked figure was gone. Just like that, he vanished. I stood frozen, staring at the empty spot where he had been, trying to make sense of it all. Was he gone for good? Or had he simply slipped away into the shadows again? I rushed out of the store as quickly as I could, the sense of dread thick in the air. My hands were clammy, my heart racing. I could still feel the weight of his unseen eyes on me, following me as I hurried to my car. But it wasn't over. The following day, I received a message from a colleague at the store. She had sent me a photo, something she had found while cleaning up the back office. It was a snapshot of the back of the store, just beyond the employee-only area. The photo had been taken at night, but in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was the masked man. This time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward the camera. His posture was hunched, and his gait was slow, deliberate. But it wasn't the man's presence that chilled me the most. It was the fact that no one else in the store had seen him. The photo was taken from a camera and no one remembered being there. I immediately went to the store, my hands shaking, my thoughts spinning. I had to confront this once and for all. But as I arrived, the store was eerily quiet. Empty. There were no other cars in the parking lot, no lights on. I stepped inside, and it was like stepping into a ghost town. Everything was perfectly still, untouched, like no one had been there for days. Except for the footprints in the dust, leading toward the back door. And that's when I realized I wasn't the only one being watched. I followed the footprints, my feet barely making a sound on the cold, tiled floor. The silence in the store was suffocating, and each step I took only seemed to magnify the feeling of dread that gripped me. The faint flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead did nothing to reassure me. Instead, they seemed to intensify the oppressive atmosphere. The footprints led me to the back office, and I hesitated before pushing the door open. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to face whatever this was. The moment the door creaked open, I was hit by a rush of stale air, as if the room had been sealed off for days. I switched on the light, and it flickered once, twice, before settling. The office was exactly how I remembered it, except for the unmistakable sense of something being wrong. Something was off, like an invisible presence was lurking just out of sight, watching. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like a trap, like the room itself was waiting for me to make a mistake, to step closer, to open a door I wasn't supposed to open. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the office, there was a cabinet. It was the same one where we kept all the cleaning supplies, but something about it seemed wrong. It was slightly ajar. I couldn't remember ever leaving it like that. Slowly, I made my way toward it, the air feeling colder with each step. When I reached the cabinet, I hesitated. My hand trembled as I gripped the door, my breath shallow. I had no idea what I was expecting, but a part of me was certain that whatever was hidden inside the cabinet was connected to the masked man. I opened the door. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just cleaning supplies, old boxes of stock, and a few dusty rags. But then, buried beneath them, was something else. Something dark. A large, black plastic bag. It was out of place, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been handled many times. My stomach churned as I knelt down to open it, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. What I found inside made my blood run cold. It was a mask, his mask. The same white, expressionless mask that he always wore. But this time, it was smeared with something dark, something that looked like blood. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. I felt the room closing in on me, the walls pressing in as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the still, empty office. But the air had changed. The oppressive feeling had returned, heavier than before. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. He was here. I heard a faint noise, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew, without a doubt, that it was him. The masked man. I backed away from the cabinet, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced for a way out, but every escape route seemed blocked, as if the very building was conspiring to keep me here. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the soft scrape of shoes on the tile floor. I had to act. I had to escape before it was too late. But as I turned to run, the door to the back office slammed shut. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in sharp, erratic gasps. I pounded on the door, shouting, but no one responded. The noise of my own panic filled my ears, drowning out the sound of the footsteps. I looked around for something, anything, that could help me escape. That's when I saw it, a window. It was small, but it was open just enough to crawl through. I rushed toward it, throwing myself at the frame, but my fingers slipped. I was losing time. I could feel him getting closer. And then, I saw him. The masked man stood in the doorway, his presence like a suffocating shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel his gaze on me. That chilling, unnatural silence. I froze, every instinct screaming for me to run, but my body was frozen in place, as though paralyzed by his gaze. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air became thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as though time had slowed down, each second stretching into eternity. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in my mind long after he stopped speaking. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew that I had no more chances left. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, he was gone. I was left standing there in the silence, heart racing, unable to move, unable to understand what had just happened. The room was empty. No sign of him. No trace of his presence. But I knew he had been there, and he had left a mark on me. As I stumbled out of the store and into the cold night, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else. The masked man was still watching me, and he would never stop. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.